The impact of historical events on men and women in the 1910s. Life as a woman in 1910s America. The 1910s was a transformative decade for women, marked by significant social, political, and cultural changes. The era saw the rise of the women's suffrage movement, shifts in fashion, and the impact of World War I on gender roles. This is part 2 of the 1910s series. In part 1, we looked at what being a man in 1910s America was like, and that video will be linked in the description box of this video along with additional ways you can support the channel. I really appreciate you joining me. Now let's jump right into history. At the beginning of the 1910s, America was a country made up of 47 states containing a little over 95 million residents, with roughly 44 million of those being female. For the average woman of that period in America, you were named Mary, Helen, or Dorothy, and you were 5 foot 4 inches tall. It was during this decade that Midol was created for general pain relief, but was often taken to ease cramping, and Kotex used cellulose-cotton, commonly used in bandages for its superior absorbency, to create the first period product for women in 1919. This was a time of great innovation, not just in the personal care sector, but in many other industries as well. Most of the people granted patents were men, with some women even using their husband's name to secure a patent. Beulah Henry was an exception to this, though. She began sketching out inventions when she was a young girl. In 1912, at age 25, she received her first patent for an ice cream freezer. A year later, she patented a handbag and a parasol. In all, Henry earned 49 patents, the last one issued in 1970. In the early 1910s, inventions by women accounted for less than 1% of all patents issued in the United States. The main reason for this was that in the early 1910s, women's roles were predominantly centered around the home. They were expected to manage household duties, care for children, and support their husbands. Middle and upper class women often had domestic help, while working class women juggled domestic responsibilities with labor-intensive jobs. Women in rural areas frequently engaged in agricultural work alongside their household duties. This was backbreaking work, and most women dreamed of the day they'd meet Thor. Not that Thor, but this one. The Thor was a drum-type washing machine with a galvanized tub. The device was invented by Alva J. Fisher and patented in 1910. While the Thor was nice to have around, women still had to refill the water before washing and rinsing, and also had to get creative when drying clothes, especially if you lived in the frigid northern regions of the states. In 1910, the legal age to marry in the United States was 14 years old. The census of 1910 shows that of the population of women 15 years and older, 58.9% of them were married, 10.6% were widowed, and just 6% were divorced. The average mother in the United States had 2 to 3 children. For the average woman, you were responsible for doing all of the shopping for your family. As you embarked on your shopping trip in the 1910s, you could expect to purchase Del Monte sliced pineapple for 22 cents a can, Quaker oats for 9 cents per package, and 2 pounds of kidney beans for just 18 cents. Opportunities for women's education and employment were limited but gradually improving. Teaching, nursing, and domestic service were common professions. In 1910, women constituted about 23% of the labor force in the United States. Within 100 years, that number has doubled to 47% of our workforce being female as of 2023. Educational institutions began to open their doors to women, albeit slowly, leading to a gradual increase in female literacy and professional aspirations. When America was struck with the realities of war, our economy went into overdrive, and when many of our young men were shipped overseas, it was up to minorities and women to step into the jobs left here at home. War not only upended family bonds through death and tragedy, but it also began a realignment within the family structure, with women gaining more independence, mostly out of necessity. This realignment, coupled with the women's suffrage movement, raised tensions among the sexes in a way we hadn't seen in our country thus far. The women's suffrage movement, which sought to secure the right to vote for women, was a defining aspect of the 1910s. This movement had been gaining momentum since the mid-19th century, but reached a critical point during this decade. And while certain states allowed women the right to vote, even sending the first woman to Congress in this decade, women could not vote in federal elections until 1920. Although she could not vote for who would lead our country, Republican Jeanette Rankin of Montana was elected to the United States Congress in 1916, paving the way for future female representatives and sparking hope for the suffrage movement. At the request of Susan B. Anthony, Senator A. Sargent, a Republican from California, introduced the 19th Amendment in 1878. Sargent's amendment, also known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, was defeated 4 times by a Democrat-controlled Senate. It would take 42 years of activism and social change for the amendment to be certified. While the suffragist movement was spearheaded by Republicans, there were Democrat women such as Margaret Sanger who believed women should have the right to vote as well. Sanger, a believer in eugenics, was a leading advocate for suffrage and for birth control. She opened the first birth control clinic in the United States in 1916 in a New York City slum. As we move into events surrounding women's suffrage, what symbolized you as a suffragist was often your clothing, more specifically your white clothing. The message women were sending was that white, long associated with youth, virginity, and moral virtue, indicated that women intended to vote for politicians and policies that would better society. On March 3, 1913, the women's suffrage procession took place in Washington, D.C., organized by the National American Women's Suffrage Association and led by Alice Paul. This event was a pivotal moment, drawing national attention to the suffrage cause. Thousands of women marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, demanding the right to vote. While this event was mostly peaceful, there were other events that happened in 1913 that weren't. Most notably, on June 8, 1913, Emily Wilding Davison, a militant suffragette and member of the Women's Social and Political Union, died after being struck by King George V's horse during the Epsom Derby. Davison ran onto the track in front of the horse while wearing 2 WSPU flags and attempted to grab the reins or attach a scarf to the bridle. The horse plowed into Davison, somersaulted, and landed on top of its jockey, Herbert Jones. Davison was taken to the hospital by stretcher where she died 4 days later without regaining consciousness. Davison's death overshadowed the race and made her a martyr to the cause of women's suffrage. This event highlighted the collective desperation of women to be included in the voting process. The trend of more aggressive protests continued when in 1916 Alice Paul and Lucy Burns formed the National Women's Party, focusing on more militant tactics to achieve suffrage. Some of these activities included direct and often illegal actions to pressure the government. They cut telephone wires, set unoccupied churches on fire, broke windows, and threw rocks, among other activities. Although the NWP was known for militant tactics, they also engaged in civil disobedience as well. From January 1917 to June 1919, the NWP organized the Silent Sentinels, a group of women who stood outside the White House holding banners and demanding the right to vote. These protests, violent and nonviolent, led to the arrest and imprisonment of many suffragists, drawing further public sympathy and support for the cause. While President Woodrow Wilson had largely ignored the suffragist movement during his first term in office, his words and actions on the issue gradually changed during his second term. On September 30, 1918, he stood before the Senate to call for the passage of the 19th Amendment. Wilson's support was largely influenced by the crucial role women played on the home front during World War I. Just a few months later, the 19th Amendment was reintroduced in Congress, and on June 4, 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed, granting women the right to vote. When Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment passed its final hurdle of obtaining the agreement of 3/4 of the states. Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby certified the ratification on August 26, 1920, changing the face of the American electorate forever. The campaign for women's suffrage was long, difficult, and sometimes dramatic, yet ratification did not ensure full enfranchisement. Decades of struggle to include African Americans and other minority women in the promise of voting rights remained. Many women remained unable to vote long into the 20th century because of discriminatory state voting laws, but this movement was pivotal in paving the way for equality going forward. Like women of today, the women living in the 1910s were very aware of styles and changing trends in fashion. The Edwardian silhouette ruled the early 1910s, and it was common to see women in corsets that shaped the waist, high-necked blouses with long flowing skirts, and large elaborate hats that were adorned with feathers and ribbons. In the mid to late 1910s, fashion changed largely out of necessity. If you were the average woman in America, the reality of war for you was not only loss, but new responsibility. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 brought significant changes to women's fashion. Practicality and simplicity became the focus as women took on more active roles in society and the workforce. Hemlines rose to the scandalous mid-calf area, allowing for greater mobility. Clothing came in looser fits and simpler lines, and tailored suits and coats with military-inspired details became popular. By the late 1910s, the fashion landscape began to shift towards the styles that would define the 1920s. The emergence of the flapper symbolized the changing attitudes towards women's freedom and independence. Dresses became even shorter, often knee-length, and straight silhouettes with bound chests instead of bound waists would rule the coming decade. The 1910s was a decade of profound change and progress for women. From the fight for suffrage to the impact of World War I and the technological advancements that were redefining domestic work, women navigated a rapidly changing world. And while tensions among the sexes was a defining characteristic of this decade, their joint efforts during the 1910s were the precursor of equality for future generations of Americans. Thanks for joining me on this history coffee break. I hope you enjoyed the journey through the 1910s as a woman in America. You can check out part 1 of this mini-series on life as a man in 1910s America on my channel. I'm always open to new video suggestions, so feel free to leave those in the comments. Please subscribe and share, and I'll see you in the next one.